The world felt like it was holding its breath in the late 1930s. Everyone knew something was coming. A storm was gathering. But what kind of storm? How big would it be? How long would it last? Leaders, journalists, generals, and everyday people all had their theories. They made predictions based on the last war, on new technology, on their own hopes and fears. They looked at new airplanes and saw cities turn to dust in a single night. They looked at massive new fortresses and saw an unbreakable defense. They looked at their own nations and saw an unbreakable will to stay out of another foreign mess. They were experts, they were confident, and they were, in so many ways, spectacularly wrong. The conflict that unfolded between 1939 and 1945 defied nearly all expectation. It was faster, bigger, and more technologically revolutionary than anyone had imagined. Why did so many intelligent people get the future so wrong? What were they looking at that led them to such mistaken conclusions? Number 21, will the next war be over in a few weeks? This was one of the most common beliefs. When German forces moved into Poland in September 1939, many observers in London, Paris, and Washington saw it as a tragedy, but a limited one. The thinking was rooted in a mix of recent memory and economic theory. The First World War had been a long, grinding stalemate. Nobody wanted a repeat. Therefore, strategists assumed the next war would have to be short and decisive. A country would either win quickly or its economy would collapse. The German campaign in Poland seemed to prove the theory. It was over in about 5 weeks. This reinforced the idea of a swift, lightning war. Commentators pointed to the speed of the armored divisions and the effectiveness of the Air Force. They saw a new model of warfare where victory was achieved before the enemy could fully mobilize. In the United States, many isolationist voices, including prominent figures in the America First Committee, used this as an argument. They claimed the conflicts in Europe were fast-moving regional disputes, not a global struggle that required American intervention. A quick victory for one side or the other, they argued, would mean a quick return to stability. The economic argument was just as persuasive. A British economist, John Maynard Keynes, had written extensively about the ruinous economic consequences of the last war in his 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. The lesson learned was that modern industrial nations could not sustain a total war effort for years on end. Their complex economies were too fragile. They would run out of money, resources, and public support. The blockade was seen as the key weapon. Britain's Royal Navy, it was believed, could simply cut off Germany's access to vital resources like oil, rubber, and food. Deprived of these, its war machine would grind to a halt within months. A report from the British Ministry of Economic Warfare in late 1939 optimistically predicted that the German economy would face a serious crisis by the spring of 1940. But this prediction missed two crucial things. First, it underestimated the power of ideology and state control. The German regime was able to mobilize its economy for war to a degree that Western democracies at first found unimaginable. It could command factories to change production, control prices, and ration goods with brutal efficiency. Second, it misjudged the nature of conquest. By quickly overrunning its neighbors, Germany was able to seize their resources and industrial capacity, feeding its war machine with the spoils of victory. The war economy didn't collapse, it grew by consuming other economies. The conflict that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1939 would stretch on for nearly 6 brutal years, redrawing the map of the world and shattering the illusion of the quick, modern war. What do we still not know about the economic calculations of 1939? Did any government analysts secretly predict a long war, and were their reports buried? How much of the short war theory was genuine belief, and how much was public propaganda to maintain morale? Number 20 is the bomber always going to get through. In the 1920s and 30s, the airplane was the ultimate symbol of modernity and terror. Its potential seemed limitless. Military theorists, mesmerized by its power, developed a powerful and terrifying new doctrine. The core idea was that fleets of long-range bombers could fly over armies and navies and strike directly at an enemy's heartland. They could destroy factories, power plants, and most importantly, civilian morale. The belief was that no defense could stop them. This idea was most famously articulated by British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in a 1932 speech to Parliament. He stated, "With chilling certainty, the bomber will always get through." This wasn't just a politician's rhetoric. It was the dominant military theory of the era. An Italian general named Giulio Douhet was its chief evangelist. In his 1921 book, The Command of the Air, he argued that air power was revolutionary. He claimed future wars would be won not by armies on the ground, but by the air force that could inflict the most unbearable damage on the enemy's civilian population. The psychological shock of seeing your cities bombed, he argued, would force any government to surrender. His ideas were incredibly influential. Air forces around the world, including Britain's Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Corps, were built around the concept of the strategic bomber as the primary war-winning weapon. The fear was palpable. People imagined death raining from the sky. Newsreels showing the destruction of Guernica in 1937 during the Spanish Civil War seemed to confirm these fears. Well, it looked like Douhet's theories were coming true, but the prediction was flawed. It made a critical error. It underestimated the potential of defensive technology and human resilience. The first major test came during the Battle of Britain in the summer and fall of 1940. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, launched a massive air campaign designed to destroy Britain's air defenses and pave the way for an invasion. They sent hundreds of bombers, but they didn't always get through. A new secret technology called radio direction finding, or radar, changed everything. Radar stations along the British coast could detect incoming bomber formations from over 100 miles away. This gave British fighter planes like the Spitfire and Hurricane enough time to scramble and intercept them. The bomber, it turned out, was vulnerable. Coordinated fighter defenses could inflict devastating losses. Later in the war, Allied bombing campaigns against German cities were carried out on a scale that Douhet could have only dreamed of. Yet they never achieved the primary goal he predicted. They caused immense destruction and loss of life, but they did not break the German people's will to fight. In fact, some post-war studies, like the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, suggested that the bombing may have even stiffened civilian resolve in some cases. The bomber could get through, yes, but not always, not without horrific losses, and not with the decisive, war-winning psychological impact that everyone had predicted. Why was the potential of radar so widely underestimated by attacking air forces before the war? To what extent did the pre-war theories of air power ignore the lessons of the First World War, where strategic bombing had also been tried and failed to break morale? Was the unbreakable morale a myth, or did state control simply prevent its collapse from being a decisive factor? Number 19, can a line of forts actually stop an army? After the First World War, France was obsessed with one thing: never again. Never again would their country be a battlefield for a war of attrition. Their solution was the most massive and expensive defensive line ever built, the Maginot Line. It was a technological marvel, stretching along the French border with Germany. It was a chain of concrete fortresses, bunkers, and obstacles. It had underground railways, air-conditioned barracks, and giant retractable gun turrets. To the French public and much of the world, it was seen as impenetrable. The prevailing military thought in France was that the next war would be a defensive one. The Maginot Line would hold the German army at bay, giving the French army time to mobilize fully. They believed it had made a direct invasion of France impossible. This thinking was a direct product of the 1914 to 1918 conflict. That war had been defined by trenches and static defense. Generals who had made their careers in that environment, like French Commander-in-Chief Maurice Gamelin, saw the future of war through that lens. They believed that defensive firepower would always trump offensive mobility. The Maginot Line was the ultimate expression of this belief. It was designed to channel a German attack. The French High Command assumed that Germany would not dare attack the line directly. Instead, they would be forced to go around it through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. But the French considered the Ardennes to be impassable for a modern, mechanized army. The terrain was too hilly and densely wooded. So they left that section of the border relatively lightly defended. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The German military leadership, particularly generals like Heinz Guderian, had been developing a completely new kind of warfare. It was based on speed, surprise, and concentration of force. They didn't see tanks as slow-moving infantry support weapons as the French did. They saw them as the spearhead of a new kind of army, capable of deep, rapid penetration. They called it the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. In May 1940, the German army did exactly what the French thought was impossible. The main thrust of their invasion came directly through the Ardennes. Hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles poured through the forest, completely bypassing the main strength of the Maginot Line. They punched a hole in the weak French defenses on the Meuse River and raced for the English Channel, encircling the best units of the French and British armies. The impenetrable line of forts had been rendered irrelevant without a single major assault. It stood as a silent, powerful testament to a strategy that was brilliantly prepared to fight the last war. The French had spent billions of francs on a solution to a problem that no longer existed. Why did French military intelligence fail so completely to understand the new German doctrine of mobile warfare? Were there dissenting voices within the French high command who warned against the over-reliance on a static defense line? How much did the public's psychological need for a symbol of security, like the line, influence military strategy? Number 18, will America ever join the fight? In the late 1930s, the overwhelming mood in the United States was isolationist. The memory of the First World War was still fresh and bitter. Over 116,000 American soldiers had died in a conflict that many felt had been about European empires, not American interests. A powerful political movement rose from this sentiment. Its goal was to ensure that the U.S. would never again be dragged into a foreign war. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts in the 1930s that made it illegal to sell arms or lend money to nations at war. The most prominent voice for this cause was the America First Committee. Formed in 1940, it quickly grew to over 800,000 members. And its most famous spokesman was the celebrated aviator Charles Lindbergh. He and other leaders argued passionately that the U.S. was safe, protected by two vast oceans. They believed that getting involved in Europe's turmoil would only weaken America and destroy its democracy. From the perspective of leaders in Berlin and Tokyo, this was a very welcome sign. They built their entire strategic plans around the assumption that the United States would remain neutral. They were convinced that the American public simply did not have the will to fight another major war overseas. They saw the debates in Congress and the massive rallies of the America First Committee as proof. They believed that even if President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted to enter the war, the American people would never allow it. This belief was a cornerstone of their long-term strategy. It allowed them to plan their conquests in Europe and Asia without factoring in the immense industrial and military power of the United States. They predicted that by the time America might consider getting involved, the war would be over, and they would be faced with an unchallengeable new order. But they were misreading the situation. While the isolationist sentiment was strong, it was not the only force at work. President Roosevelt was convinced that the security of the United States was directly threatened by the events in Europe and Asia. He began a careful and deliberate campaign to shift public opinion and circumvent the neutrality acts. He spoke of the U.S. becoming the arsenal of democracy. In March 1941, he pushed the Lend-Lease Act through Congress. This program allowed the U.S. to supply war materials to Britain and other allied nations, effectively ending the pretense of strict neutrality. The final fatal blow to the prediction of American isolation came on December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii shattered the illusion that America could sit out the global conflict. The attack instantly unified the country and silenced the isolationist movement overnight. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy, honoring their pact with Japan, declared war on the United States. The prediction that America would stay on the sidelines was utterly destroyed. The industrial giant that the Axis powers had bet would remain asleep was now fully awake and committed to their total defeat. Did the leaders in Berlin genuinely believe American isolationism was permanent, or did they simply hope it would last long enough for them to win? How critical was the Lend-Lease Act in preparing the American public and industry for war before the official entry? What if the attack on Pearl Harbor had never happened? Could the US have maintained its neutrality? Number 17, are battleships still the queens of the sea? For centuries, the battleship was the ultimate symbol of naval power. It was a floating fortress, armed with the largest guns in the world and protected by thick steel armor. Nations measured their strength by the number of battleships they had. Generals and admirals, men like Alfred von Tirpitz in Germany before the First World War, and naval theorists like Alfred Thayer Mahan in the US had built their careers on the doctrine of the decisive battleship fleet engagement. The entire naval strategy of the early 20th century was based on the idea that a war at sea would be won by a massive clash between fleets of these steel giants. This thinking continued right up to the start of the Second World War. The world's major navies continued to pour vast sums of money into building bigger, faster, and more powerful battleships. Germany built the Bismarck. Japan built the Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed. The United States was building its Iowa-class battleships. These ships were seen as the core of the fleet, the weapon that would ultimately determine control of the seas. The aircraft carrier was a relatively new invention. Most senior naval officers saw it as a useful support vessel, a scout for the main battle fleet, but not as the primary offensive weapon. They believed that a carrier was too vulnerable. A few well-aimed shells from a battleship could sink it, while the battleship itself could shrug off hits from the flimsy-looking airplanes a carrier launched. This prediction was tested and proven wrong with shocking speed and brutality. The war demonstrated in a series of dramatic events that the age of the battleship was over. The new queen of the seas was the aircraft carrier. The first major sign came in November 1940. British torpedo bombers flying from the carrier HMS Illustrious attacked the Italian fleet at anchor in Toronto Harbor. In a single night, they crippled 3 Italian battleships, shifting the balance of power in the Mediterranean. It was a stunning demonstration of what a small number of aircraft could do. The most famous example, of course, was the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. A fleet of 6 Japanese aircraft carriers sailed in secret across the Pacific and launched over 350 aircraft. They sank or damaged 8 U.S. battleships. 8 U.S. battleships. The American carriers, by sheer luck, were out at sea. This single event proved that a carrier fleet could project power across vast distances and destroy a battleship fleet at its moorings. But just 3 days later, the lesson was driven home again. The British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse were sent to intercept Japanese landings in Malaya. Sailing without air cover, they were attacked by Japanese torpedo bombers based on land. Both ships, considered to be modern and powerful, were sunk in less than 2 hours. An admiral who had once said that a plane couldn't sink. A battleship went down with his ship. The era of naval aviation had arrived. Why were so many senior naval leaders so resistant to the idea of air power? Was it institutional inertia, or was there a genuine belief, based on pre-war exercises, that battleships could defend themselves? How did the design and doctrine of navies that embraced carrier power, like the Japanese and later the Americans, differ from those who clung to the battleship? Number 16, can the Soviet Union survive an invasion? In June 1941, the German regime launched the largest land invasion in history, Operation Barbarossa, against the Soviet Union. In the weeks that followed, German forces advanced hundreds of miles, encircled entire Soviet armies, and captured millions of prisoners. To most observers in the West, the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed not just likely, but imminent. This prediction was based on several key factors. First, the performance of the Red Army in its recent war against Finland in 1939-40 had been shockingly poor. The small Finnish army had inflicted huge casualties on a much larger Soviet force, exposing deep weaknesses in its leadership and tactics. Second, the Soviet military command had been decimated by a series of internal purges in the late 1930s. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had ordered the execution or imprisonment of thousands of his most experienced officers, including the brilliant Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky. This left the army poorly led and disorganized. Intelligence estimates in London and Washington largely agreed with the German assessment. U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson famously remarked that he believed Germany would run through the Soviet Union like a hot knife through butter. A British intelligence report from late June 1941 predicted a Soviet collapse within 10 weeks. The German High Command itself planned for a campaign lasting no more than 3 or 4 months. They were so confident that they didn't even issue their troops with winter clothing. They expected to be in Moscow long before the first snowfall. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. The prediction failed because it underestimated three critical Soviet strengths. The first was sheer geography. The Soviet Union was enormous. The German armies could advance hundreds of miles and still have hundreds more to go. This vast space stretched their supply lines to the breaking point. The second was industrial capacity. The Soviets had, in the years before the war, relocated much of their heavy industry east of the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of German bombers. While the German army was capturing factories in the west, new factories in the east were churning out thousands of tanks, like the famously effective T-34 and aircraft. The third, and perhaps most important, was human resilience and the brutal resolve of its leadership. The Soviet government was able to mobilize its population on a scale of total war that was almost unimaginable. Despite staggering losses numbering in the millions, the Red Army was able to constantly form new divisions and throw them into the fight. The brutal Russian winter, the general winter that had helped defeat another invader over a century before, also took a terrible toll on the unprepared German soldiers. By December 1941, the German advance had ground to a halt at the gates of Moscow. The short, victorious campaign was over. A long, brutal war of attrition had begun. How much did racial ideology in Berlin contribute to the underestimation of the Soviet people's will and ability to fight? Did Western intelligence agencies have any sources inside the Soviet Union that provided a more accurate picture of its military and industrial strength? What was the true state of Red Army morale in the disastrous first few months of the invasion? Number 15 is Japan just a regional power? In the years leading up to the war in the Pacific, the Japanese military was widely underestimated by the Western powers, particularly the United States and Great Britain. There was a prevailing, and deeply racist, view that Japan was a nation of imitators, not innovators. Western military experts believed that Japanese soldiers were not as skilled. Japanese pilots had poor eyesight, and Japanese technology was a shoddy copy of Western designs. They were seen as a formidable power in their own region, capable of bullying a weak China, but not as a serious threat to the major industrial powers. This sense of superiority was widespread. A 1941 U.S. Army intelligence report on the Japanese military was dismissive of its capabilities. It claimed their equipment was second-rate, and their strategic thinking was unimaginative. Many British commanders in Singapore shared this view, believing that Japanese troops accustomed to a different climate would be unable to fight effectively in the jungles of Malaya. The possibility that Japan would dare to launch a direct attack on the United States or the British Empire was considered by many to be almost laughable. They were seen as having neither the resources, the technology, nor the audacity for such a move. The prediction was that Japan, if it chose to expand, would move south to seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and would try to avoid a direct conflict with the US and Britain for as long as possible. The American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor was seen as a powerful deterrent that would keep Japan in check. This confidence led to a dangerous level of complacency. The first 24 hours of the Pacific War, on December 7 to 8, 1941, completely demolished this prediction. In a series of brilliantly coordinated and executed attacks, Japan struck across a vast front. They attacked Pearl Harbor, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet. They bombed American airfields in the Philippines, destroying most of the U.S. air power in the region on the ground. They landed troops in Malaya and began a stunningly rapid advance toward the fortress of Singapore. It quickly became clear that all the pre-war assumptions had been wrong. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter was, at that time, superior to any Allied fighter in the Pacific. The Japanese pilots were highly trained and experienced. Japanese soldiers were tough, disciplined, and expert at jungle warfare. The Japanese Navy possessed a powerful and well-trained carrier fleet. In the first 6 months of the war, Japan achieved an unbroken string of victories, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. They had proven themselves to be far more than just a regional power. They were a first-rate military force with global ambitions, and the Allies had paid a terrible price for underestimating them. What was the source of the Western intelligence failure regarding Japanese military capabilities? Were there reports from military attaches or journalists in Japan that were ignored by policymakers in Washington and London? To what extent did cultural and racial prejudice blind Western analysts to the reality of Japan's strength? Number 14, will bombing civilians break their will to fight? This was a companion to the prediction that the bomber will always get through. The core idea, championed by theorists like Giulio Douhet, was that modern war could bypass the battlefield. Instead of armies fighting armies, air forces would attack the enemy's population directly. The goal was not just to destroy factories, but to create such terror, panic, and misery among the civilian population that they would rise up and force their government to surrender. It was a theory of psychological warfare, and it was accepted as gospel by many Air Force commanders. They believed that civilians, unlike soldiers, were not trained to endure the horrors of war. The shock of seeing their homes destroyed and their neighbors killed would shatter their morale. The constant threat of death from above would make normal life impossible. The British Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, who would later lead Britain's bomber command, was a firm believer in this doctrine. He argued that a sustained bombing campaign against enemy cities, what he called dehousing the enemy workforce, could win the war on its own. The United States Army Air Forces, while publicly claiming to focus on precision bombing of industrial targets, also operated on the assumption that the destruction of cities would have a devastating effect on enemy morale. The theory was put to the test in multiple theaters of the war. The German Air Force tried it against London and other British cities during the Blitz from 1940 to 1941. Later in the war, the British and American Air Forces unleashed a far more destructive air campaign against German cities. In the Pacific, American B-29 bombers carried out a devastating firebombing campaign against Japanese cities. In every case, the result was the same. The bombing caused incredible destruction and suffering, but it never produced the predicted collapse of civilian morale. It did not lead to a popular uprising or a demand for surrender. In Britain, the Blitz seemed to have the opposite effect, uniting the population and strengthening their resolve to resist. The famous keep calm and carry on spirit, while partly a creation of government propaganda, reflected a genuine resilience. Post-war surveys of German civilians conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey found that while the bombing had a severe impact on their daily lives and created a sense of hopelessness, it did not translate into a desire to overthrow their government. Instead, people focused on day-to-day survival. The same was true in Japan. The will to fight, sustained by a powerful state apparatus and a strong cultural identity, did not break until the military situation was completely hopeless and new, terrifying weapons were introduced. The theory that you could bomb a nation into submission proved to be a deadly and costly failure. Why did the theory of morale bombing persist for so long, even when evidence from the Blitz suggested it was not working? Were there psychological studies conducted before or during the war that supported or refuted the theory? How did governments on all sides use propaganda to counter the psychological effects of the bombing on their own populations? Number 13, are tanks just for supporting infantry? When the tank first appeared on the battlefields of the First World War, it was a revolutionary but clumsy weapon. It was slow, unreliable, and used mostly to break through barbed wire and machine gun nests, creating a path for the infantry to follow. In the years after the war, most armies continued to see the tank in this limited role. The dominant military doctrine, especially in France and Britain, was that tanks should be distributed in small groups among the infantry divisions. They were seen as mobile pillboxes, a tool to help the foot soldier, not as a decisive weapon in their own right. The French army, considered the most powerful in Europe in 1939, had more tanks, and in many cases better tanks than the German army. But their strategy was to sprinkle them along the front line. They believed in a methodical, controlled battle where the infantry was still the queen of the battlefield. This thinking was personified by the French High Command, who were mostly veterans of the slow, grinding battles of the previous war. They simply could not imagine a battlefield dominated by speed and movement. A small group of military theorists and officers, however, saw things differently. In Britain, men like J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Little Hart wrote about a new kind of mechanized warfare. In Germany, Heinz Guderian took these ideas and put them into practice. Guderian argued passionately in his 1937 book Achtung Panzer that tanks should not be spread out. They should be concentrated into powerful, independent formations called panzer divisions. These divisions, combining tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery, would be the spearhead of the army. They would not just help the infantry advance, they would smash through the enemy's front line, drive deep into their rear areas, and cause chaos and collapse. They would target command centers, supply lines, and communication nodes. This was a radical departure from conventional thinking. The German military leadership adopted Guderian's ideas. When they invaded Poland in 1939 and then France and the Low Countries in 1940, they unleashed this new form of warfare. The world watched in shock as German panzer divisions, supported by dive bombers, bypassed strong points, encircled entire armies, and moved at a speed that seemed impossible. The French and British tanks, tied to their slow-moving infantry units, were unable to react. They were defeated not because they were inferior weapons, but because their doctrine was outdated. The German army had correctly predicted that the tank was not just an infantry support weapon, it was a revolutionary tool that could win battles and campaigns on its own terms. This concept of combined arms mechanized warfare would come to dominate land combat for the rest of the century. Why were the French and British military establishments so resistant to the new ideas about armored warfare despite the writings of their own theorists? Did the results of the Spanish Civil War, where tanks were used by both sides, provide misleading lessons? How much of the success of the new doctrine was due to the technology itself, and how much was due to superior training, communication, and leadership? At number 12, can a country really be starved into submission? The blockade was a classic weapon of naval warfare, and Great Britain had used it to great effect against Germany in the First World War. By cutting off Germany's access to seaborne trade, the Royal Navy had contributed to severe shortages of food and essential materials, which weakened the German war effort and eroded morale on the home front. When war broke out again in 1939, the British government was confident that this weapon would be just as effective, if not more so. The Ministry of Economic Warfare was established to oversee the blockade. Its analysts produced optimistic reports predicting that Germany, which was heavily dependent on imports of key materials like iron ore, oil, and rubber, would be crippled within months. The logic seemed sound. Germany's industrial economy was a complex machine that needed a constant supply of raw materials. Cut off that supply, and the machine would seize up. The British press and public shared this confidence. They saw the Royal Navy, the most powerful in the world, as a silent, suffocating force that would inevitably squeeze the life out of the German war economy. This prediction, however, overlooked several new realities of the 1940s. First, Germany had spent years preparing for a blockade. The government's four-year plan, initiated in 1936, was specifically designed to achieve autarky, or economic self-sufficiency. They developed synthetic alternatives for key materials like producing oil from coal and rubber from chemicals, Buna rubber. While these processes were expensive and inefficient, they provided a baseline of supply that could not be cut off by a naval blockade. Second, the nature of conquest had changed. In the First World War, the fronts were largely static. In the Second, Germany's rapid military victories gave it control over the resources of most of continental Europe. After the fall of France in 1940, Germany could exploit French industry, Romanian oil fields, and Swedish iron ore, which was shipped across the protected Baltic Sea. The blockade could stop ships from the Americas or Asia, but it could not stop trains and barges moving across a conquered Europe. The German Grosswirtschaft, large economic space, was, for a time, a blockade-proof economic empire. Finally, the prediction underestimated the ability of the German state to manage and ration resources with extreme efficiency. Non-essential industries were shut down, and every available resource was funneled into the war effort. While the blockade did cause shortages and difficulties, it was never the war-winning weapon that the British had hoped for. The German war machine was ultimately not starved into submission. It had to be destroyed on the battlefield. Did British economic intelligence have accurate data on Germany's synthetic fuel and rubber production before the war? To what extent was the public belief in the blockade a way to maintain morale during a period when Britain had few other ways to strike back at Germany? How did Germany's trade agreements with the Soviet Union between 1939 and 1941 affect the blockade's impact? Number 11. Is Germany's economy built for a long war? This is a fascinating prediction because, in a way, it was both right and wrong. Many economists and analysts in Britain and France looked at the German economy in the late 1930s and saw a house of cards. They saw an economy that was overheating due to massive government spending on rearmament. It had high levels of debt and was facing labor shortages. The conclusion many drew was that this kind of economy could not possibly sustain a long, drawn-out conflict. It was built for a short, sharp war, a blitzkrieg, after which it would need to return to peacetime production to avoid collapse. And this analysis was largely correct. The German leadership, particularly in the early years of the war, structured the economy around this very idea. Their plan was blitzkrieg economics, a rapid mobilization to win a quick victory, followed by a demobilization to allow the economy to recover and enjoy the spoils. Unlike Britain, which moved to a full war footing almost immediately in 1939, Germany maintained a surprisingly high level of civilian consumer goods production well into 1941. The leadership was wary of imposing too many hardships on the German population, fearing a repeat of the home front collapse of 1918. So they gambled on a series of short campaigns. The prediction that the economy couldn't handle a long war was therefore based on a sound reading of Germany's economic strategy. Where the prediction failed was in underestimating Germany's ability to change that strategy when the short war plan failed. The turning point came with the failure to defeat the Soviet Union in the winter of 1941 to 42. Suddenly, Germany was faced with exactly the scenario it had tried to avoid: a long, two-front war of attrition against the industrial might of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and soon the United States. At this point, many outside observers might have predicted an imminent economic collapse, but that didn't happen. In early 1942, a new figure, Albert Speer, was appointed as the Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer was a brilliant organizer. He ruthlessly rationalized the German economy for total war. Civilian production was slashed. Factories were reorganized for maximum efficiency. Resources from all over occupied Europe were systematically plundered and funneled into German industry. The use of forced labor from occupied territories on a massive scale also provided the manpower needed to keep the factories running. The result was what historians call the armaments miracle. German war production covers of tanks, aircraft, and submarines did not peak in 1940 or 1941, but in 1944 when the war was already strategically lost. The economy that was supposedly built only for a short war proved to be remarkably resilient and adaptable, capable of sustaining a colossal war effort for years longer than anyone had thought possible. Did Allied intelligence understand the shift in German economic policy under Speer in 1942? How much did the plunder of occupied Europe contribute to the German armaments miracle compared to gains in production efficiency? Was the initial guns and butter economic policy a sign of weakness or a calculated political move to maintain public support? Number 10, can the French army hold the line again? In 1939, the French army was widely considered to be the most powerful army in the world. It was large, well-equipped, and had a reputation forged in the victory of the First World War. Allied strategy was built on this foundation. The plan was simple. If Germany attacked, the British Expeditionary Force would move into Belgium to fight alongside the French, and the two armies would stop the German advance, just as they had done a generation before. A long stalemate might ensue, but nobody seriously predicted a rapid French collapse. This confidence was based on both numbers and history. The French had more tanks than the Germans. Their artillery was excellent. Their soldiers were believed to be brave and well-trained. Their senior commanders, Gamelin, Weygand, were venerated veterans of the Great War. They were the victors. The memory of their tenacious defense at battles like Verdun was a core part of their military identity. They had the Maginot Line securing their direct frontier. The prediction was that the French army was a rock, an unbreakable barrier that would hold the Western Front. The prediction was wrong because it mistook superficial strength for real strength. It looked at the number of tanks, but not at the doctrine for using them. It looked at the reputation of the generals, but not at the rigidity of their thinking. The French army of 1940 was suffering from a deep institutional sickness. Its command structure was slow and bureaucratic. Communication was poor. Many tanks lacked radios, making it impossible to coordinate them effectively in a fast-moving battle. Their strategy was entirely defensive and reactive. They planned to wait for the enemy's blow and then counter it, a fatal approach when facing an enemy whose entire strategy was based on speed and surprise. The German invasion in May 1940 exposed these weaknesses with brutal speed. When the German armored columns broke through the Ardennes, the French high command was paralyzed. Their decision-making cycle was too slow. Orders from headquarters took hours or even days to reach the front lines, by which time the situation had completely changed. No field commanders were often left without instructions, unsure of what was happening. The psychological shock of the Blitzkrieg was immense. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a conceptual one. The French were fighting a methodical 1918-style war, while the Germans were fighting a fast-paced 1940-style war. In just 6 weeks, the army that was supposed to be the most powerful in the world had been utterly defeated. The fall of France sent a shockwave across the globe and completely upended the strategic balance of the war. How aware were British military leaders of the deep doctrinal and communication problems within the French army before May 1940? Were there junior French officers who advocated for new tactics but were ignored by the high command? To what extent did political instability in France during the 1930s contribute to the military's institutional weakness? Number 9, will Britain simply make peace after a defeat? From the perspective of Berlin in the summer of 1940, the war in the West was over. France had been defeated. The British army had been driven off the continent at Dunkirk, forced to leave behind most of its heavy equipment. Britain stood alone, seemingly defenseless against the most powerful military machine in Europe. The logical, rational next step, from the German point of view, was for Britain to recognize the reality of its situation and sue for peace. This prediction was based on a conventional understanding of power politics. The German leadership believed that the British were pragmatists. Their empire was vast and overstretched. They would surely see that continuing the fight was hopeless and would only lead to the destruction of their cities and the potential loss of their empire. The German chancellor made several public peace offers and speeches, essentially offering to let Britain keep its empire in exchange for a free hand in continental Europe. He and many of his generals fully expected Britain to accept. They saw the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, as a belligerent outlier and assumed that the realist faction of the British government, represented by figures like Lord Halifax, would eventually prevail and bring the country to the negotiating table. This was a profound misreading of the political and psychological situation in Britain. It failed to understand that for the British government and people, the war was no longer a traditional conflict over territory or influence. It had become a war for national survival and against a system of governance they saw as fundamentally evil. The idea of negotiating a peace with a regime that had just conquered most of Western Europe was seen not as pragmatic, but as a total moral and strategic surrender. Winston Churchill's leadership was crucial. He masterfully articulated this sentiment. In his famous speeches during that summer, he offered not compromise, but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He spoke of this as Britain's finest hour and vowed to fight on the beaches. He rallied the nation around a spirit of defiance, not accommodation. The German leadership, used to a political system where the will of the leader was absolute, seemed incapable of understanding the power of this democratic consensus. They waited for the peace offer that never came. When it became clear that Britain would not negotiate, their only remaining option was to attempt an invasion, an operation for which they were ill-prepared and which depended on first achieving air superiority in the Battle of Britain. The failure to predict Britain's resolve was a major strategic blunder. How close did the British government actually come to considering a negotiated peace in May and June of 1940? What was the role of the monarchy and public opinion in solidifying the national will to fight on? Did German intelligence have any assets inside the British government, and what were they reporting back to Berlin about the political climate? Number 8 are submarines, just a nuisance weapon. In the First World War, German U-boats had come perilously close to starving Britain into submission. Yet, by the end of the war, the development of the convoy system, sonar, then called ASDIC, and depth charges seemed to have tamed the submarine threat. In the interwar years, a sense of complacency set in among many naval leaders, particularly in the British Admiralty. They believed they had solved the submarine problem. The prevailing view was that submarines, while still a potential threat to merchant shipping, were no longer a strategic war-winning weapon. ASDIC, an early form of active sonar, was seen as a near magical detection device. It was believed that any U-boat that dared to attack a convoy would be quickly located by the escorting warships and destroyed. The German Navy itself did not initially prioritize submarine construction, focusing instead on large surface warships. The head of the German Navy, Admiral Erich Raeder, was a battleship man. The submarine commander, Karl Donitz, argued for a large U-boat fleet, but he was a minority voice. The initial prediction on both sides was that the naval war would be dominated by surface fleets and the submarine would play a secondary nuisance role. This prediction was shattered in the long and brutal campaign that became known as the Battle of the Atlantic. It turned out that the solution to the submarine problem was far from perfect. Early ASDIC was limited. It could be fooled by thermal layers in the water and was useless against a submarine on the surface. The U-boats, under Donitz's brilliant and ruthless leadership, developed new tactics to counter the convoy system. They operated in groups called wolf packs, which would overwhelm a convoy's small escort. They often attacked at night on the surface, where they were faster than many of the escort ships and invisible to ASDIC. For several years, the U-boats inflicted devastating losses on Allied shipping, sinking millions of tons of supplies, food, and war materials. As Britain was once again brought to the brink of collapse, the submarine was not a nuisance. It was the single most serious threat to the Allied war effort. It took a massive coordinated effort to eventually win the battle. This involved new technologies like high-frequency direction finding, Huff-Duff to locate U-boat radio transmissions, long-range patrol aircraft to close the air gap in the mid-Atlantic where U-boats had operated safely, and the mass production of escort vessels. The breaking of the German naval Enigma code by cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park was also a decisive factor, allowing the Allies to reroute convoys around known wolf pack locations. The submarine had proven itself to be one of the most effective strategic weapons of the war. Why was the British Admiralty so overconfident in the capabilities of ASDIC before the war? To what extent did inter-service rivalry between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command hinder the early anti-submarine effort? How did the tactical innovations of U-boat commanders at sea challenge the pre-war doctrines of both sides? Number 7 is paratrooper power, the future of invasion. In the early years of the war, airborne forces seemed like a game-changing new weapon. The sight of thousands of soldiers dropping from the sky behind enemy lines was both terrifying and revolutionary. It seemed to make traditional front lines obsolete. An army could now leap over defenses and seize key objectives like bridges, airfields, and command centers from within. The German military were the pioneers of large-scale airborne operations. They used paratroopers and glider-borne infantry with stunning success in their campaigns of 1940. They seized key bridges in Belgium and Holland, paving the way for the advance of their armored divisions. They captured the impregnable Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael by landing a small force of glider troops directly on top of it. These successes created an aura of invincibility around the Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers. Many military analysts predicted that this was the future of warfare. Large-scale airborne invasions, they believed, would become a standard and decisive tactic. The ultimate test of this prediction came in May 1941 with the German invasion of the Mediterranean island of Crete. It was the largest airborne invasion ever attempted. The entire operation was to be conducted by air, with paratroopers and glider troops seizing the island's 3 airfields, which would then be used to fly in reinforcements and supplies. The German high command was confident of a swift victory. But the invasion of Crete turned into a near disaster for the airborne forces. The Allies, thanks to ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park, knew the invasion was coming. They had heavily reinforced the island. The German paratroopers were dropped into the teeth of prepared defenses. They suffered horrific casualties. The fighting for the airfields was desperate. At Malimi Airfield, the key objective, the Germans came within a hair's breadth of defeat. Here, they ultimately captured the island. But the cost was staggering. They lost thousands of their elite, highly trained paratroopers, and a huge number of transport aircraft were destroyed. The German leadership was so shocked by the losses on Crete that he concluded the age of large-scale paratrooper assaults was over. He famously said that the day of the parachute troops is over. Germany never again attempted a major airborne invasion. The Allies, however, learned from the German experience. They built their own large airborne divisions and used them in the invasions of Sicily, Normandy, and Holland. But they used them as a supporting element to seize key objectives ahead of a main amphibious or land-based assault, not as the sole means of invasion. Crete had shown that while airborne forces were a powerful new tool, they were also incredibly vulnerable. The prediction that they would replace traditional invasions as the primary means of attack was proven to be a bloody miscalculation. Why did the German military, despite their success, abandon large-scale airborne operations after Crete? Did the Allies, in planning operations like Market Garden, fully absorb the lessons of the high casualties suffered on Crete? How did the development of transport aircraft technology during the war change the potential and limitations of airborne forces? Number 6, can consumer factories really build war machines? In 1940 and 1941, the Axis powers looked at the United States and saw a nation that was materially wealthy but spiritually soft. They saw a consumer society obsessed with cars, radios, and refrigerators. Its army was tiny, ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. Its factories were designed to build Fords and Chevrolets, not tanks and bombers. The prediction from Berlin and Tokyo was that even if the U.S. did enter the war, it would be unable to convert its civilian industry to military production quickly enough to make a difference. This belief was based on a misunderstanding of the nature of American industrial capitalism. They saw the focus on consumer goods as a weakness, not as a sign of immense, flexible, underlying capacity. They believed that the complex machine tools and assembly line techniques used for cars could not be easily adapted to the more precise and demanding work of building military hardware. And German military planners, in a 1941 study, concluded that American mass production methods were unsuited for the production of the complicated and constantly changing designs of modern armaments. They predicted it would take the U.S. years to become a serious military industrial power. This was arguably the single greatest miscalculation of the entire war. The American business community, led by figures like William S. Knudsen of General Motors, who was brought in by President Roosevelt to lead the production effort, took on the challenge with incredible speed and ingenuity. The arsenal of democracy was not just a political slogan, it became an industrial reality. The auto industry was the prime example. The Ford Motor Company, which had perfected the assembly line for the Model T, built a massive new factory at Willow Run, Michigan. At its peak, this single plant was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Chrysler, a company that made passenger cars, built over 25,000 tanks. A company that made lipstick tubes produced shell casings. A toy train manufacturer made bomb fuses. The scale of the transformation was breathtaking. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced more military equipment than all the Axis nations combined. This included nearly 300,000 aircraft, over 86,000 tanks, and millions of guns and trucks. This flood of material not only equipped the American military, but also supplied its allies, including Britain and the Soviet Union, through the Lend-Lease program. The consumer factories that were dismissed as a sign of weakness turned out to be the country's greatest strategic asset, a war-winning engine of production that a centrally planned, resource-poor Axis economy could never hope to match. How did the American government and private industry cooperate so effectively to achieve this rapid conversion? What specific technical challenges had to be overcome to switch a factory from making, for example, refrigerators to making aircraft parts? Did German or Japanese industrial spies provide any accurate reports on the true potential of American industry? And if so, were they ignored? Number 5, will guerrilla warfare have any real impact? Traditional military thinking in the 1930s and 40s focused on conventional armies. Wars were fought between soldiers in uniform on clearly defined battlefields. Irregular warfare, or what we would now call guerrilla warfare, was seen as a sideshow. It was a problem for colonial powers dealing with local uprisings, but not something that could have a significant impact on a major war between industrial nations. When German forces occupied large parts of Europe, from France to the Soviet Union, their military leadership expected the civilian populations to be cowed into submission. They believed that any resistance would be easily crushed by their security forces. They predicted that partisan or resistance movements would be a minor policing problem, not a serious military threat. Their own military doctrine had no real answer to it, other than brutal reprisals against the civilian population, which they assumed would deter any further resistance. This prediction completely underestimated the power of organized, widespread resistance. In many occupied countries, resistance movements emerged that became a major thorn in the side of the occupying forces. In Yugoslavia, the partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito, grew into a formidable army that tied down dozens of German and Italian divisions. At its peak, Tito's army numbered some 800,000 fighters. They were not just a nuisance, they were a de facto second front in the Balkans. In France, the Maquis conducted sabotage operations, gathered intelligence, and helped downed Allied airmen escape. As the D-Day invasion approached in 1944, the French resistance, armed and coordinated by the British Special Operations Executive SOE and the American Office of Strategic Services OSS, launched a campaign of sabotage against railways, bridges, and communication lines that seriously hampered the German ability to move reinforcements to Normandy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, later estimated that the contribution of the French resistance to the Normandy campaign was equivalent to 15 regular divisions. In the vast occupied territories of the Soviet Union, Soviet partisans waged a relentless war behind German lines. They destroyed supply trains, ambushed patrols, and forced the German army to divert huge numbers of frontline troops to rear area security duty. The German High Command had planned to use these areas for rest and refitting. Instead, they became a constant battleground. The prediction that guerrilla warfare was irrelevant was proven false. Resistance movements did not win the war on their own, but they provided invaluable intelligence, drained enemy manpower, and played a crucial strategic role in the eventual Allied victory. How did the different resistance movements, with their often conflicting political ideologies, manage to coordinate their efforts? What was the true cost of resistance in terms of civilian reprisals, and how did that affect recruitment and popular support? To what extent did the success of partisan warfare in this conflict influence the doctrines of insurgency and counterinsurgency for the rest of the 20th century? Number 4 is Scandinavia, a safe, neutral zone. At the start of the war, the Scandinavian countries Denmark, Norway, and Sweden all declared their strict neutrality, just as they had in the First World War. They hoped and expected to stay out of the conflict that was engulfing the rest of Europe. Most of the major powers initially seemed willing to respect this neutrality. The dominant prediction, both within Scandinavia and abroad, was that the region would remain a peaceful backwater isolated from the main theaters of war. This belief was based on the assumption that neither side had a compelling strategic reason to violate Scandinavian neutrality. The region was not on the direct path of invasion between Germany and France. It was seen as being on the periphery. The Scandinavian governments invested their diplomatic efforts in maintaining this status, hoping that by showing no favor to either side, they would be left alone. But this prediction failed to account for a critical economic and strategic resource, Swedish iron ore. Germany's war machine was heavily dependent on high-grade iron ore from mines in northern Sweden. During the winter, the northern Baltic Sea froze, so this ore had to be transported by rail to the Norwegian port of Narvik and then shipped down the coast of Norway to Germany. The British government, led by Winston Churchill, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty, saw this as a major vulnerability. He argued that if Britain could cut this supply route, it could seriously damage the German war economy. He began to plan for a preemptive occupation of Narvik and other Norwegian ports, a clear violation of Norwegian neutrality. The German leadership was also acutely aware of this vulnerability. They feared that the Allies would seize Norway and cut off their vital ore supply. They also saw Norway's long coastline as a potential base for their navy and air force to operate against Britain in the North Atlantic. Based on this strategic calculation, they decided to act first. In April 1940, in a surprise operation, German forces launched a simultaneous invasion of both Denmark and Norway. Denmark, being flat and indefensible, was overrun in a matter of hours. In Norway, the fighting was much fiercer, with Norwegian and later British and French forces putting up a stiff resistance. But ultimately, Germany secured control of the country. The invasion of Scandinavia completely shattered the prediction of a safe neutral zone. It demonstrated a key lesson of the war in a total conflict. Neutrality was a privilege that would only be respected as long as it suited the strategic interests of the belligerent powers. The moment a neutral country's territory or resources became strategically important, its neutrality was in grave danger. Sweden managed to maintain a precarious neutrality throughout the war, but only by making significant concessions to Germany. The rest of Scandinavia was pulled directly into the heart of the conflict. What were the internal debates within the British government regarding the proposed violation of Norwegian neutrality? How did Swedish diplomacy manage to succeed in keeping the country out of the war when its neighbors failed? And did Allied and German intelligence have accurate assessments of each other's intentions towards Scandinavia in early 1940? Number 3, can radar really see in the dark? In the late 1930s, a new technology was being secretly developed in several countries. The British called it RDF radio direction. Finding the Americans later coined the term radar. The basic principle was simple. By sending out a pulse of radio waves and listening for the echo, you could determine the range, direction, and altitude of a distant object, like an airplane. To the handful of scientists and military officers who understood it, it seemed to have revolutionary potential. But to many senior military commanders, especially in the more traditional branches of the armed forces, the whole idea seemed like science fiction. They were skeptical. Their experience was with weapons they could see and touch: guns, ships, and aircraft. The idea of an invisible beam that could see for 100 miles, day or night, in any weather, was hard to grasp and even harder to trust. There was a widespread prediction, or perhaps assumption among many in the military establishment, that these newfangled gadgets would be unreliable in the stress of real combat and would not be a decisive factor. The German Air Force, for example, had its own radar research but did not initially integrate it into a comprehensive air defense system, underestimating its defensive power. The skepticism was proven wrong in the most dramatic way possible during the Battle of Britain in 1940. The British had invested heavily in radar and had built a network of radar stations along their southern and eastern coasts called the Chain Home System. This system was the key to their victory. It gave them early warning of incoming German bomber formations, allowing them to husband their limited number of fighter aircraft. Instead of flying wasteful standing patrols, they could keep their fighters on the ground until they were needed and then guide them directly to the enemy. Without radar, the Royal Air Force would have been fighting blind. The technology continued to evolve and prove its worth throughout the war. Smaller radar sets were developed that could be fitted into aircraft. This created effective night fighters that could hunt enemy bombers in complete darkness, a feat that had previously been almost impossible. Air radar was also installed on ships, allowing them to detect enemy vessels and aircraft far beyond the horizon and to aim their guns accurately at night or in thick fog. In the Battle of the Atlantic, patrol aircraft equipped with radar could spot surfaced U-boats at night, taking away their greatest advantage. Radar was not just a gadget. It was a fundamental game changer that influenced the outcome of almost every major campaign of the war. The initial prediction that it was an unreliable novelty was one of the most significant technological misjudgments of the era. Why was the British military more willing to embrace and integrate radar into their strategy than other powers were initially? How did German intelligence fail to appreciate the significance of the prominent radar towers being built along the English coast before the war? What were some of the early technical failures of radar that might have fueled the skepticism of military leaders? Number 2, will the war stay in Europe? When the war began in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland, it was, for most of the world, a European affair. The conflict was between European powers over European issues. While empires were involved, the fighting was confined to the European continent. The United States was neutral. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany. Japan was engaged in its own war in China, but was not yet part of the larger conflict. The widespread prediction was that this would be a repeat of the First World War, a massive, tragic but ultimately European-centered conflict. This view shaped the early strategies of all the major powers. Britain and France planned for a war fought in France and Belgium, and Germany planned for a war to establish dominance over the European continent. The United States based its foreign policy on the assumption that it could remain isolated from a war that was taking place over there. Even as Germany conquered most of Western Europe in 1940, the perception of a geographically limited war largely held. But this prediction failed to account for the global nature of ideologies, alliances, and ambitions. The world of 1939 was far more interconnected than the world of 1914. In September 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, a defensive alliance that formally linked the conflicts in Europe and Asia. This was a clear signal that the war was becoming a single global struggle. The signatories agreed to assist each other if any of them were attacked by a power not already involved in the war, a clear warning to the United States. The definitive event that shattered the European war prediction was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This act instantly transformed the parallel wars in Europe and Asia into a single global world war. The United States was now at war with Japan in the Pacific. Just days later, Germany and Italy, honoring the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States. The conflict now stretched from the frozen steppes of Russia to the tropical jungles of New Guinea, from the deserts of North Africa to the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Soldiers from Australia and India fought in North Africa. Americans fought in Europe and Asia. Chinese forces fought in Burma. Brazilians fought in Italy. The war involved combatants from every inhabited continent. It was fought on the land, on the sea, under the sea, and in the air, on a scale that dwarfed any previous conflict in human history. The initial belief that the fire started in Poland could be contained within Europe proved to be a fatal illusion. How seriously did American policymakers take the threat of the Tripartite Pact when it was signed in 1940? Did the German leadership fully anticipate that declaring war on the U.S. would lead to a Germany-first strategy from the Allies, focusing the main effort on Europe? What were the key logistical and strategic challenges of transforming separate regional conflicts into a single, coordinated global war effort? Number one, is trench warfare inevitable again? The First World War had burned a single, dominant image into the minds of a generation of military leaders: the trench. The war on the Western Front from late 1914 to 1918 was a static nightmare of barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery, where offenses gained a few hundred yards at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. The power of the defense seemed to have become absolute. As tensions rose in the 1930s, the almost universal prediction among the Western Allies was that the next war would be a repeat of the last one. They expected a long defensive struggle. The French built the Maginot Line, the ultimate trench system made of concrete and steel. The British Expeditionary Force, sent to France in 1939, came equipped for static warfare, even bringing along soccer balls for recreation during the expected long periods of inactivity. This period of inaction from September 1939 to the spring of 1940 was dubbed the Funny War, a term that perfectly captured this expectation of a slow, grinding conflict. The prevailing military doctrine was that the machine gun and the artillery piece still ruled the battlefield, and that any attempt at a rapid breakthrough was doomed to fail. This prediction was based on a failure of imagination. It assumed that technology and tactics had not fundamentally changed. But they had. While the French and British armies were still largely horse-drawn and organized around the foot soldier, the German army had been experimenting with the revolutionary new concept, the Blitzkrieg. As discussed earlier, this doctrine combined the new technologies of the tank and the dive bomber with the old principle of Schwerpunkt, concentration of force, to achieve rapid, decisive breakthroughs. They also mastered communication using radio to coordinate their fast-moving units in a way that the Allies could not match. The German plan for the invasion of France in 1940 was the polar opposite of a static trench war. It was a high-risk gamble on speed and movement. When the attack came in May, it completely confounded the Allied predictions. There was no long stalemate. There was no trench warfare. The German armored columns simply drove around or through the Allied defenses, moving so fast that the Allied high command never caught up with the reality of the situation on the ground. The War of Movement, which had died in 1914, had been reborn in a new and even more terrifying form. The prediction of an inevitable return to the trenches was not just wrong, it led to a strategy and a mindset that made the Allies uniquely vulnerable to the very kind of war their enemy had planned. The most deeply ingrained lesson of the last war turned out to be the most dangerous illusion for the next one. Why did the experience of the fast-moving race to the sea in 1914 not feature more prominently in Allied military thinking as opposed to the static years that followed? To what extent was the funny war a result of this prediction versus a genuine lack of preparedness for an offensive? Did the military exercises conducted by the French and British armies in the 1930s ever seriously test their ability to respond to a rapid mechanized breakthrough?